Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Tonight, we're diving headfirst into a time when the world was hilariously absurd, deeply weird, and yet somehow beautifully simple. Before Wi-Fi, before television, before the soul-draining scroll of social media, people still had one major problem to solve: boredom. And believe it or not, they solved it in ways so ridiculous, so brilliant, and so deeply human that modern life starts to look a little robotic by comparison. Imagine waking up in a crooked little village somewhere in 14th century Europe. No alarms, no smartphones, just the gentle, passive-aggressive gurgle of a nearby cow who has very strong opinions about your presence. The village is barely awake, still yawning through its cracked windows and leaning rooftops. Chimneys puff lazy curls of smoke. Mud squelches underfoot with the kind of wet regret that makes you question going outside barefoot. And somewhere, a rooster decides not to crow. He's not dead. He's just emotionally unavailable today. That's the kind of morning we're stepping into. Now, let's be clear. Entertainment in the medieval era wasn't just rustic. It was downright unhinged. People didn't just pass time. They weaponized boredom into an art form. They didn't have Netflix, but they had pig-chasing competitions, cheese wrestling tournaments, and yes, competitive farting. That's right. In a world without TikTok, the medieval answer to "what should we do tonight" might literally have been, "let's see who can pass gas the loudest." But before you scoff, understand this. This wasn't just comedy. It was community, competition, and culture, all rolled into one gloriously smelly spectacle. Back in the village, a baker's boy tumbles off a stool in a spectacular crash of flour and mild profanity. His head hits the oven, and he blames the oven for existing. His bakery smells like warm sleep, ash, and someone's forgotten sock. Behind the sacks of rye, the baker arms like tree trunks and snores like thunder, is completely dead to the world. Outside, a pig sneezes into someone's laundry. A dog scratches its ear against a cartwheel like it's paying off a debt. And two elderly women sit at a bench near the well, swaddled in layers of shawls and decades of sharp opinions. One of them declares that the sun is shining too brightly, which obviously means something terrible is about to happen. The other believes the silent rooster is a death omen, or a sign someone forgot to wind the sky. She's not entirely sure how it works, but she's absolutely convinced goats are involved. That's the beauty of medieval fun. It didn't need structure, just suspicion, superstition, and a decent chunk of free time. Nearby, a boy creeps past the church holding a bucket with a single, judgmental fish in it. He's supposed to deliver it to the village reeve, but he's strongly considering eating it himself, raw, scales and all. He sneaks past a man stumbling out of the tavern, one boot on, one chicken underarm, and a daisy behind his ear. The chicken looks genuinely alarmed, and high above it all, the rooster, nameless, and perhaps disillusioned with humanity, watches from the thatched roof of the blacksmith's shed. He stretches a wing, fluffs his feathers, and judges silently. He watches as the baker's boy burns his finger, as a child falls into a puddle and stays there, waiting to see if anyone brings him a plum out of pity. He sees the forge hiss to life. The hammering hasn't started yet, but the air knows it's coming. Medieval villagers lived in this odd, blurry moment between night and day. Too early to be productive, too late to go back to sleep, and in that space bloomed some of the strangest, most ridiculous pastimes you could imagine. Entertainment was not about polish, it was about presence, about making the best of the absurd. A woman stirs a pot that's been boiling since before anyone can remember. The porridge inside makes a noise like it's trying to protest its own existence. Her husband grumbles into his loaf, a sacred ritual repeated daily with the same sleepy curses and the same lump of food. But then again, tradition is just repetition with meaning, isn't it? Outside, neighbours tie garlic to their babies' ankles to ward off demons. One woman spits over her shoulder after feeding the dog, just in case. Another rubs mud on her forehead because someone's aunt once said it brings good fortune. These were the fun rituals of the morning, and they were taken very seriously. But don't be fooled into thinking that these people lived dull, empty lives. If anything, they were experts at squeezing joy out of chaos. They made theatre out of survival. They laughed in the face of plague and poverty. And sometimes, They did it through holy pigs and haunted laundry. One old woman claims a pig wandered into the churchyard again and ate half a psalter before being chased off with a broom. This sparks a debate. Was the pig now sacred or blasphemous? Elizabeth, the village's local philosopher, suggests it's both. Just like some men in this village, she adds, breaking her oatcake in half with ominous force. You see, fun in the medieval world didn't need rules, it needed characters. And boy did the village have characters. There was Lionel, the scribe, who once spilled ink all over his cat. The cat, insulted beyond reason, walked across his manuscript and left paw prints like tiny insults in every corner. Lionel whispered to it, "I didn't see anything." The cat blinked and left the room like it had just ended a toxic relationship. There was Edwin, the stable boy, tasked with milking a cow named Gertrude. Gertrude, of course, was in a mood. She was always in a mood. She kicked him, drenched him, sent him flying across the hay with the elegance of a ghost and the force of a battering ram. And yet, Edwin came back, because that's what entertainment often is. The willingness to repeat the ridiculous until it feels like purpose. There were kids who formed shovel brigades, basically gangs of dirt-throwing lunatics, screaming war cries like, "You dig, you duck, you scream if you get hit." Rotten vegetables flew like missiles. Supervisors were ignored. Laughs were loud. Injuries were minor. And joy was abundant. By the time the sun finally rose high enough to be taken seriously, the village had already survived 7 minor disasters, 2 ghost stories, and 3 existential chicken sightings. And all of it was fun. Not just because it was funny, but because it was shared. Because it was shared. That's what defined medieval fun more than anything else. Not the spectacle, not even the absurdity, but the togetherness. The unspoken agreement that yes, this might be ridiculous, but we're ridiculous together. By late morning, the heat had thickened just enough to make every task slightly unpleasant, which made everything more dramatic than it had any right to be. 2 boys argued over who would carry a bundle of firewood. One of them eventually declared it a matter of honour, invoked St. Crispin, and staged a duel with wooden spoons. The winner received nothing. The loser got splinters, but both grinned like champions. In the distance, the clatter of hoofbeats stirred dust across the lane. No rider, just a loose cart horse wandering back from somewhere it shouldn't have been. It had a ribbon tied to one ear and a smug look, as if returning from a secret party. Someone's laundry flapped from its tail. Over by the well, gossip had fermented into storytelling. Bertha recounted, for the 5th time that week, how her sister was once nearly abducted by fairies, or possibly tax collectors disguised as fairies, and only escaped by throwing a clove of garlic at them. "Garlic's not just for stew," she said with a knowing nod, tearing her oatcake with surgical precision. Beside her, the oldest man in the village. No one knew his real name, only that he had outlived 4 barbers, and 1 bishop offered up his contribution, the tale of the sacred turnip that glowed in the dark. Whether from holiness or rot he wasn't sure, but he insisted it hummed. "You had to be there," he muttered, eyes distant. The children nearby had given up pretending to be busy. Now they sat cross-legged in the dirt, huddled around a small pit they'd filled with mud and beetles, trying to summon spirits or, failing that, a reason to skip chores. One girl announced she was practicing for the village's annual farting competition. It was, apparently, a serious event, with a turnip trophy and everything. The other children nodded solemnly. Excellence must be honoured, even if it comes from the lower intestine. There was an unspoken rule. No one mocked the farting games. It was one of the few competitions that transcended age, gender, and sobriety. People trained, people strategized, and those who won were remembered, sometimes with song, often with cautious distance. The blacksmith, whose hammer had finally begun its daily symphony, paused only to yell at a passing chicken that had stolen a coin from his windowsill. Whether the bird understood was debatable. It did pause, blinked twice, and then ran off with the coin still in its beak, proving that either the chicken was a criminal or the blacksmith had accidentally paid it. The line between fun and madness was thin in these parts, but it was a line the villagers walked with grace. As the sun reached its peak, meals were prepared with varying levels of enthusiasm. Some households had boiled eggs. Others relied on whatever we find in the cupboard that hasn't spoken yet. Bread, hard as a saint's resolve, was dunked into watery broth. One man claimed his soup had 3 flavors: salt, onion, and disappointment. But meals were not just for nourishment, they were for performance. A widow claimed she hadn't eaten since Tuesday. It was Thursday. She made the statement while eyeing a pie with such intensity it began to sweat. The tavern keeper's son, soft-hearted and soft-headed, slipped her 2 boiled eggs and a piece of stale pie. She winked. He blushed. The chickens outside sensed a plot. Inside the tavern, bets were already being placed for the evening's "Guess What's in This Pie" contest. Entry was free. Regret was extra. Last year, someone won with a guess of onion and shoe leather. He'd only been half right. In one corner, a group of children were staging a reenactment of Sir Turnip and the Dragon of Dirt. The dragon was a boy with a bowl of ash and a tragic sense of direction. Sir Turnip wore a bucket on his head and spoke only in grunts. The battle was fierce, mostly accidental, and ended when someone tripped over the cat, who then declared war on the entire room. No one won. Everyone cheered. That was medieval joy in its purest form. No need for logic, only laughter. Outside, the air shimmered. Somewhere behind the monastery, Brother Cuthbert was arranging cabbages into spiral patterns. Some said he did it to honour a forgotten saint. Others said it was how he talked to frogs. The frogs offered no comment. The shoemaker, slow as ever, passed by the square on his way back from nowhere in particular. He had the heavy gait of someone who treated walking like a moral decision. Children played around his feet. He smiled without urgency, as if the entire day belonged to him. Nearby, 2 teenagers exchanged awkward glances and shared a plum, which might as well have been a marriage proposal. They sat beneath a tree, neither speaking, both pretending not to notice how close their elbows were. A bee buzzed past, perhaps bored of the sweetness. By late afternoon the games became weirder. One group began debating whether the local goat was actually a divine reincarnation of the village founder. This was not the first time such a theory had emerged. Last year, they briefly declared a beetroot to be the chosen one before it was eaten by a pig. No one was upset. Mysticism had a shelf life. Pigs did not care. Songs broke out spontaneously. Some were hymns. Others were bawdy rhymes about someone's cousin and a very unfortunate incident involving a ladder. Laughter echoed through the streets like music played by memory. As the sky shifted to a warmer hue, torches were lit in anticipation of the night. Tables were dragged into the open. Drinks were poured. The old woman with the oatcakes began distributing them like holy offerings. People dipped them into mead, into soup, into anything vaguely edible. Someone bit into one and claimed they saw God. No one questioned it. They all nodded. They all agreed. Because in this strange little village, entertainment wasn't something you watched. It was something you did. You lived it. You spilled it. You tripped over it and laughed anyway. And when the bell finally rang, no one remembered who rang it or why. It didn't signal the end of the fun. It signaled a pause, a breath, because tomorrow they'd do it all again. And maybe the rooster would crow this time. Maybe the rooster would crow this time. But it didn't. Not because it couldn't, but because it had standards. Somewhere beneath a lopsided roof, it glared at the morning like it had been personally offended by the sunrise. Its silence hung over the village like a smirk, daring anyone to question it. Meanwhile, a crowd had already begun to gather near the open green, just beyond the well-worn footpaths and the suspiciously judgmental statue of St. Barnaby the Flatulent. It was an unspoken rule that any open space not immediately occupied by a sheep, a puddle, or someone's half-finished cart was fair game for games. And this morning, they weren't preparing for work. They were preparing for war. Not the sword and armour kind, but the kind fought with cheese, mud, and blind optimism. Bertha had announced it, loudly, dramatically, with a fist raised and a crust of bread still in her hand. It's Cheese Day. This was not an official holiday. It wasn't tied to any saint or harvest. But for reasons lost to time and probably common sense, the villagers had decided years ago that once every few weeks someone should chase a wheel of hard, dangerous cheese down a hill, and others should wrestle for it when it stopped. There were no rules, only 2 certainties. You would fall and you would regret winning. The hill itself wasn't much to look at, just a muddy slope riddled with rabbit holes and the kind of grass that gave up growing in straight lines. But once the cheese was released, gravity took over. and what gravity didn't handle, chaos did. The chosen cheese this year was particularly formidable, a dense wheel of goat cheddar named Mabel by the baker's daughter because she looked mean, and mean she was. By the time Mabel hit the bottom of the hill, she had taken out 2 participants, a bench and a goose. The goose survived, the bench did not. Following close behind the cheese came the human avalanche, limbs flailing, knees scraping, laughter erupting in a chorus of wheezes and oaths. Children cheered, elders placed bets. One man lost a shoe but found someone else's wallet, which he politely returned after checking for coin. At the finish line, marked only by a crooked stick and a sleepy-looking dog, stood Martha, a blacksmith's apprentice with 4 arms like oxen and a glare sharp enough to slice cabbage. She didn't run after the cheese, she waited. And when it stopped rolling, she pounced like a hawk. The wrestlers who followed barely had a chance. Within seconds, 3 were face down in the mud. 1 was clinging to a nearby tree, and the 4th had accidentally tackled the dog. Martha, victorious, held Mabel aloft like a war trophy, grinning through a face full of dirt and victory. The villagers roared, but Cheese Day was only the beginning, because just beyond the green, preparations were underway for the main event, the Great Pig Chase. Unlike Cheese Day, this had a loose origin. Legend said that long ago a pig named Wilbur had escaped his pen during a wedding feast and caused such a ruckus, tripping the priest, stealing the bride's bouquet, and eating half the cake, that the villagers declared him a hero. Since then, they honoured his memory by letting a new pig loose and chasing it for sport. Today's pig was named Hamuel. Small, pink, fast, and deeply uninterested in public attention, Hamuel had been chosen for his agility and unwillingness to be caught. A ribbon was tied to his tail, and a crowd of nearly 20 villagers gathered, stretching and limbering up as if preparing for battle. Someone asked if chasing pigs counted as cardio. The cobbler, chewing on his 3rd oatcake, nodded solemnly. Only if you survive. The chase began with a scream, unclear whether from Hamuel or a startled toddler. But either way, it was on. Hamuel darted between legs, under skirts, through baskets, and once directly over a startled cat. Villagers stumbled over each other like tipsy dominoes. One man face planted into a bucket and stayed there for a moment, re-evaluating his life choices. Another tried to leap a fence and ended up inside a cart of cabbages. Meanwhile, Hamuel ran like the wind, or more accurately, like the wind after 3 bowls of soup and no nap. Children joined in. So did a few chickens. The lines between contestant, spectator, and collateral damage blurred quickly. By the time Hamuel was finally caught by a 9-year-old girl who cornered him near the bakery and offered a bribe of apples, the village looked like it had been through a storm. A storm made of pigs, sweat, and blind enthusiasm. The girl held up Hamuel, triumphant. The villagers cheered. Hamuel sighed. The baker gave her a roll as a prize. She gave it to the pig. He accepted. That was the rhythm of their lives. Wild, silly, full of bruises and belly laughs. And when the crowd had calmed, someone produced a fiddle. The fiddler wasn't particularly good. He had 2 songs, both of which sounded vaguely like apologies. But the people danced anyway because that was the point. Dancing wasn't about form. It was about forgetting that your knee hurt. Your bread was hard and your roof leaked. Couples twirled unevenly. Children made up steps on the spot. The elderly clapped in rhythm with varying success. Even the priest, who claimed to be above such things, tapped his foot under his robe and looked away, pretending not to smile. Nearby, a group of boys set up a new game involving mud, sticks, and a very confused frog. They called it Battle of the Marsh King. The rules were unclear. The frog objected. No one listened. Back at the tavern, the day's champions were given honorary mugs of cider, watered down, of course, and toasted as heroes. Martha and the pig-catcher girl sat beside each other, proudly muddy, happily bruised, and already retelling their glory in exaggerated detail. The pig sat under the table, eating crumbs like royalty. That evening, stories spread like wildfire. Tales of Mabel the killer cheese, of Hamuel the uncatchable, of the cobbler who tripped over a butter churn and invented a new dance move in the process. Every detail stretched, every fall funnier, every bruise more dramatic. And as the torches flickered and shadows stretched long, The village settled into its quiet again. The rooster, from his perch, finally let out a croaky, half-hearted crow. No one noticed, or if they did, they let him have the moment. The day had been stupid and brilliant, exhausting and perfect, just like all the best ones. Because for them, entertainment didn't come from somewhere else. It lived right there, beneath the mud, behind the laughter, between a wheel of cheese and a runaway pig. And tomorrow, something equally absurd would happen again, because that's just what people did. Because that's just what people did. And sometimes, what they did was weirder than anyone could explain. After the pig had been fed and the cheese had been recovered, the village found itself in that peculiar post-festivity lull, the calm between ridiculous storms. It never lasted long. This time, it was broken by Oswin the tanner, a man who smelled of leather and old socks, and who, without warning, declared that it was the perfect day for sack-fighting. Now, this wasn't sack-fighting as in burlap-clad combatants punching each other senseless. No, this involved climbing onto a wooden beam suspended over a shallow ditch of rainwater and spoiled cabbage, each participant holding a stuffed grain sack, and attempting to knock their opponent off with sheer awkward force. There were no safety measures, no real rules, just enthusiasm, balance, and the willingness to land flat in something that smelled like medieval regret. Oswin climbed up first, his balance questionable from the start. His opponent, a shepherd named Garin, removed his boots, claimed it gave him better grip, and climbed onto the other side. The crowd gathered quickly, some placing bets, others handing over children for better viewing angles. The air was filled with the sharp tang of wet wool and anticipation. On the count of 3, the sacks flew. Oswin swung first, missed completely, and spun halfway around like a windmill with a bad hinge. Garan took the opportunity to nudge rather than strike, gently tipping Oswin into the muck below with the grace of a man pushing a rotten apple off a shelf. The crowd howled. Oswin stood, dripping and righteous, and declared the ditch holy. "This water is blessed by humiliation," he shouted, arms wide. No one argued. Next came the children's turn, which, unsurprisingly, turned into chaos. Instead of trying to knock each other down, they began swinging wildly, giggling, shrieking, and eventually turning the game into a kind of rhythmic mud ballet. 2 fell off on purpose just to see who could make the biggest splash. A third attempted a flip and landed in someone's cooking pot, which had been cooling beside the path. The pot survived. The dignity of all involved did not. It was in these moments, mud-slicked and ridiculous, that medieval life gleamed, not in the halls of kings or parchment of scribes, but in ditches filled with cabbage and laughter. Elsewhere, a different sort of game began, one involving riddles, lies, and the kind of bluffing that would make any gambler proud. The villagers called it Fool's Market. The premise was simple. You bring an item, any item, and try to convince everyone it's something else entirely. The more absurd your claim, the more applause you earned, if you pulled it off without laughing. Bertha brought a brick and swore it was St. Clevis's lost tooth. "It's rectangular because he was wholly in angles," she said. The crowd nodded, murmuring as if contemplating sacred geometry. Oswin returned, soaked but undeterred, with a fish wrapped in cloth, claiming it was a divine message disguised in cod. "It only reveals its meaning if you stare at it during thunderstorms," he insisted. One boy stared at it for a solid minute before declaring he felt weird inside. The game went on for hours. Someone sold a broken comb as a relic from a dragon's lair. Another offered a potato carved into a questionable likeness of the king's uncle. The priest, finally joining in, brought an old candle and announced it was hope in physical form. The candle immediately went out. Everyone cheered, but the day wasn't done, not even close. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows over the road, the carts began to arrive from neighbouring hamlets. Word of the cheese race and pig chase had spread, and other villagers came, not just to watch, but to compete. This led to the emergence of the unofficial, unsanctioned, and entirely improvised Tri-Mud-Athen. 3 events, all stupid, all magnificent. First, the cabbage toss, a test of both strength and distance, where contestants hurled cabbages as far as possible without losing control of their arms or their tempers. The champion was a wiry woman named Elfrida, who threw hers so far it landed in someone's stew 3 houses down. The stew's owner declared it an upgrade and offered her a spoonful. Next was blindfolded duck herding, which, as the name suggests, involved attempting to guide ducks into a pen while blindfolded, using only clapping and persuasive insults. The ducks, being ducks, had no interest in cooperation. One escaped entirely and joined the fiddler under a tree. He played a tune. The duck quacked in rhythm. A partnership was born. The final event was reverse racing, running backwards down the village path while holding a bucket of water and reciting a poem of your own invention. Most participants fell, forgot the words, or spilled the water. One man managed to do all three, and still insisted he'd won emotionally. Night fell slowly, as if reluctant to cover such a day in darkness. Torches were lit again, not because they were needed, but because the flicker of flame made everything feel more dramatic. The pig, still Hamiel, wore a crown of flowers now, and sat beside the fire like a minor deity. Children braided grass into crowns. Teenagers told half-true stories about who had kissed who behind the mill. One boy claimed to have seen a ghost in the cheese wheel. Another said he was the ghost. The music continued, badly and beautifully. Voices raised in messy harmony. Feet moved without instruction. Laughter leaked between the cottages like smoke. And above it all, the stars returned, distant and disinterested. For just one evening, life didn't need a script. It didn't need a reason. It only needed people willing to look foolish together. And they did. Spectacularly. And then, like always, the laughter softened. The songs slowed. Somewhere a dog barked once and gave up halfway through. The moon slipped higher into the sky, casting silver across rooftops like it was decorating a cake it didn't want to bake in the first place. But even as the festivities dimmed, the villagers weren't done. Tomorrow promised a different kind of entertainment, one that brought everyone out, from wide-eyed children to the grumbling elders in crooked hats. It was punishment day. Now, to modern ears, that might sound grim, barbaric even. But in medieval villages, public punishment was less a moment of fear and more of a community performance, soaked in drama, ritual, and just the right amount of petty satisfaction. The stocks stood at the centre of the village square, not tucked away in some shameful corner, but proudly positioned like a stage. And that's exactly what it was. A stage for public repentance, public mockery, and, on some occasions, public snacks. There were no metal fences, no handcuffs, no armed guards, just wooden planks, bored villagers, and an overwhelming sense of curiosity. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered with the kind of excitement usually reserved for weddings or goat births. Someone had even brought a stool, not for the condemned, but for themselves, front row seating to the drama of the hour. Children wove through the legs of adults, whispering theories and trading bets. I heard he stole 3 loaves. No, it was 4. And a spoon. Maybe he just looked suspicious. The accused this time was a man named Roderick, whose face was always a bit too smug, and whose boots were always a bit too clean for someone who claimed to be a farmer. He was led to the stocks not by guards, but by the baker and the priest, both of whom had volunteered. Roderick protested, of course, loudly, dramatically, and with a flair for poetry no one appreciated. "I am innocent," he bellowed. The bread was on sale. The spoon was a gift. No one listened. The stocks creaked open. Roderick was locked in with theatrical flair, muttering about injustice and damp wood. And then came the real show. The public wasn't content to just watch. That would have been too civilized. Instead, they participated. Someone brought old turnips. Another had a handful of stale buns that hadn't sold last week. A boy appeared with a bucket of very questionably sourced eggs. The baker's wife, not to be outdone, arrived with an apple that had already been through one argument and a fall. They didn't throw immediately. There was a rhythm to it, a slow build-up. The insults came first. Nothing truly cruel, just the sort of pointed teasing only neighbours could perfect. "Nice boots, Roderick. Still shiny. Maybe they help you tiptoe past justice. Tell us again about the magic spoon." More laughter, and then the apple flew. Not hard, just enough to bounce off his shoulder and splatter slightly. Roderick yelped. A turnip followed. Then a bun. And just like that, the air was filled with a symphony of soggy vegetables and delighted howls. No one truly hated Roderick. He wasn't dangerous. He was annoying. And this wasn't vengeance. It was theatre, a ritual, a release. Because in a world without courtrooms and comment sections, this was how a community rebalanced itself. Public shame with a side of humour. Eventually the priest raised a hand and the barrage slowed, not out of pity, but out of boredom. Roderick had been sufficiently humbled, or at least pelted. He'd spend another hour there, probably napping in defiance, and then be released with nothing more than bruises and a slightly bruised ego. Elsewhere, more serious punishments were being prepared. Not whippings or executions, those were rare and often reserved for larger towns, but something arguably worse in a place this small, humiliation rituals. Take, for example, the case of Edith the Gossiper. She wasn't cruel, she wasn't evil, but she couldn't keep a secret if her life depended on it. After a dozen minor disasters caused by her loose tongue, one involving a mistaken pregnancy announcement and a goat, her neighbours had reached their limit. They gathered not to punish her, but to honour her services to village communication. A stage was built. A fake scroll was written, detailing all the secrets she'd spread, exaggerated for flair. And then, in front of the entire village, she was crowned the Queen of Whispers, handed a wooden sceptre shaped like an ear, and made to sit on a chair that squeaked every time she moved. The audience howled, and to her credit, she laughed louder than anyone else. By the end of the evening, people were bringing her cakes and compliments. She'd been mocked, yes, but she'd also been seen, remembered, and oddly respected. Because medieval punishment wasn't always about pain, often it was about belonging, about putting someone back in their place, not beneath others, but among them. When you were punished publicly, you weren't cast out. You were pulled back in, recentered. Still, not every punishment was so benign. There was also the cucking stool, a wooden chair mounted on a long beam and placed over the river, reserved mostly for brewers who watered down their ale, or bakers who sold underweight loaves. It was a dramatic, wet lesson in accountability. The offending party would be tied to the stool, swung out over the river, and dunked repeatedly while the village jeered. Last month it had been Tomlin the aleman. He'd added too much water to his brew, claiming it was blessed dilution. The villagers disagreed. He splashed into the river 6 times, came up sputtering curses, and was later seen selling holy water ale at a discount. Sales oddly improved. And then there were the shame parades, simple in design, brutal in effect. The accused, sometimes thieves, sometimes adulterers, sometimes just people who lost a bet, would be paraded through the village in a silly costume, a hat made of onions, a tunic stitched with chicken feathers. One man had to wear a bell around his neck and announce his sins in rhyme. He was so good at it, people paid to hear him recite it again the following week. These weren't just moments of discipline, they were moments of unity. The villagers laughed together, mocked together, and eventually forgave together. Because in a world of hard work and hard winters, sometimes the only thing that kept the cracks from widening was the simple, ridiculous act of watching someone else get pelted with cabbage. And somewhere behind all that, the unspoken truth lingered. Everyone took a turn eventually. Everyone took a turn eventually. That was the unspoken agreement. Today it might be Roderick in the stocks, or Tomlin splashing in the river, but tomorrow it could be you. Maybe you borrowed without asking. Maybe you spoke too loud during chapel. Maybe your cow trampled someone's herb garden again. When the stool creaked or the stocks were opened, no one looked away. They watched, they laughed, they jeered. But they also remembered, because medieval villages weren't anonymous. They were tight, tangled webs of shared bread and borrowed buckets, whispered rumours and overlapping guilt. And in that web, public punishment served less as vengeance and more as storytelling. Living, breathing parables with mud and mockery instead of parchment and ink. There were even local legends about those who wore their shame like armour. Old Man Jory, who'd once paraded naked except for a sack of onions after being caught forging love letters in 3 different women's names. Instead of hiding, he danced through the village square with a grin so wide it broke something inside the priest. A year later, 2 of the women married other men and Jory married the 3rd. He never apologised. He said, "Well, I wrote 'em nicely, didn't I?" And they were nice letters, flowery, poetic, utterly false. But they made the recipients smile, and in the end, that counted for something. Even the priest, years later, quoted Jory's 3rd letter in a sermon. He pretended it was from Augustine. No one questioned it. Sometimes the punishments turned theatrical enough to warrant a rehearsal. One spring festival, the villagers decided to hold a trial of the turnip, inspired by a recent theft from the market. No one had confessed, but the trail of vegetable peels led to the shoemaker's apprentice. Rather than drag her to the stocks, they organised a mock court. A hay bale became the judge's bench. The accused wore a turnip mask, held together with string and regret. The blacksmith acted as the prosecutor, pounding the table with his fist every time he got bored. Witnesses included a chicken sworn in with a kiss on the beak, and a boy who claimed to have seen the thief from a tree. The boy later admitted he'd made it up for the attention. The chicken declined to comment. In the end, the apprentice was sentenced to community mischief, which involved telling stories at the tavern for 3 nights and peeling actual turnips until she understood the crime's gravity. She complied. The stories were good. The turnips were peeled. No guards, no dungeons, just consequences, embarrassment, and a public that remembered everything, especially the funny parts. Of course, not every punishment was a harmless joke. Shame could cut deep, and some never truly recovered. There was the tale of Hilda, a healer whose remedies were strange but effective. Her poultices smelled like old boots, but they cured fevers. Then one winter, a child died despite her efforts, and fear took over. She was paraded through the streets as a false witch, with soot on her cheeks and a sign that read, "Liar" in crooked script. The shame settled into her bones. She left the village by spring, taking her herbs and her boots with her. Years later, when the fevers returned, people whispered her name. Some regretted, most simply moved on, because while public punishment offered entertainment, it also enforced the border between belonging and exile, between you messed up and you're no longer one of us. And the difference wasn't always clear until it was too late. But even so, the rituals continued, like clockwork, because medieval communities needed them, not just for justice, but for rhythm. Life was built around the ordinary, feeding pigs, hauling water, patching roofs. Events like the cheese race, the pig chase, and yes, even punishment days, gave the year its texture, a pulse, a sense of progression. The stocks became part of the landscape, a reminder. Children would drape dolls over them, pretending to be judges. Teenagers dared each other to sit in them for fun. One couple even got engaged there, claiming it would set expectations. And just like everything else in village life, punishments had a season. Spring was busiest, when Kempers flared after long winters and food was still tight. Summer brought the lazy scuffles, petty thefts, ale watered down a bit too far, forgotten debts. Autumn saw fewer offences, as harvest distracted most. And winter belonged to silence. The stocks gathered snow, the stool froze in place, and no one wanted to parade through frost in shame. That was the time for whispered grievances, quietly settled. A broken fence mended without comment. The village breathing together, huddled under layers of wool and denial. But as soon as the thaw returned, so did the games. The grievances became public again. Accusations flared with the same speed as flowers in the fields. Someone had stolen soap. Someone else accused a neighbour's goat of flirting with their fence posts. And always, someone had baked something suspiciously inedible and tried to pass it off as experimental bread. It was all petty. It was all nonsense. But it mattered, because these moments gave the village stories to chew on, not the grand kind told by lords or sung by travelling bards, but local tales, passed from one muddy porch to another, stories that stuck not because of their moral weight, but because they were funny, familiar, or just absurd enough to be true. And in the end, that was what made punishment so watchable. Not the act itself, but the transformation. The thief who stumbled, the gossip who blushed, the alderman who sputtered. For a few hours they weren't just neighbours, they were characters in the ever-rolling drama of village life. Everyone watched, everyone remembered. And then, slowly, everyone forgave. Not because they were saints, but because tomorrow it might be their turn, their boot that slipped, their tongue that wagged too freely, their pie that accidentally contained a pebble. And when that happened, they'd want laughter, not exile. They'd want a pie to the face, not a pitchfork to the back. They'd want to be mocked, not forgotten. So the villagers kept gathering, kept cheering, kept peeling turnips and throwing buns. Because justice, in its weird cabbage-scented way, was a celebration. And as the sun set on another punishment day, the stocks were wiped down, the last apple call kicked aside, and someone, probably Roderick, muttered, "Same time next week?" No one answered. But they all showed up. And the very next time they did, it wasn't to throw turnips or point fingers. It was because a girl had started dancing in the square and hadn't stopped. At first, it was amusing. A few villagers paused to watch her spin in slow circles, arms fluttering like laundry caught in a breeze. She smiled, too wide, and hummed something off-key, something no one recognized. They laughed, assumed she'd had too much ale or not enough breakfast, and went back to their chores. But then she danced through lunch, and through supper, and into the darkness. By morning, 3 more had joined. Feet never stopped moving. Their faces were red, their clothes damp, and their legs trembling, but they danced as if compelled. Not gracefully, not joyfully, just endlessly, as if the rhythm came not from music, but from somewhere deep in the bones. No one could say why it started, but it wouldn't stop. He brought his candle and his suspicion, declared it unnatural, and started muttering prayers between cautious glances. A healer offered herbs, a widow offered wine, a boy threw a pebble, hoping it would knock some sense loose. Nothing worked. By the 3rd day, the dancers had grown to 12. Some villagers whispered about cursed air, others blamed spoiled grain. One man swore it was caused by too many onions in the stew the night before. But everyone agreed on one thing: this was no ordinary jig. It became known as the dancing sickness, a plague of movement, not fatal, at least not immediately, but consuming. The afflicted danced through blistered feet, strained muscles, and blank stares. They collapsed only to wake and resume the shuffle, their bodies moving long after their minds seemed to fade. The square turned into a stage again, but this time no one cheered. The blacksmith's daughter, who'd joined the dancers sometime after dusk, had started to bleed through her shoes. She didn't seem to notice. She twirled past her father's forge, eyes glazed, her once careful braids unravelling like the rhythm that held her captive. A travelling tinker, passing through with a cart full of bent tools and louder opinions, declared it a demonic influence. He stood in the square waving a bent ladle like a sword, shouting about exorcisms and hellfire until one of the dancers accidentally elbowed him in the chest. He fell backward into his cart, knocking over a pile of horseshoes and half a sack of barley. He left before sundown. Still, the dancers danced. Children began imitating them at first, not understanding the fear wrapped in the rhythm. They spun around until they grew dizzy and collapsed in the grass, giggling. But as they watched the real dancers, faces pale, knees buckling, breath shallow, the laughter dried up. They stopped imitating. The priest held a service by torchlight, reading from a cracked book with shaking hands. He sprinkled water, sang hymns, and held his candle high. For a moment, one dancer faltered, just for a heartbeat, and the village leaned in. But then she spun again, faster than before. Desperation crept in. The healer, an older woman with a voice like gravel and fingers always stained from roots, brewed a concoction so bitter it made grown men gag. She forced it down the throat of one dancer, while 2 others held her still. The girl vomited, cried, screamed something no one could understand, and then, to everyone's shock, stopped dancing. She slept for 2 days. When she woke, she remembered nothing. It became the method, rough, cruel, and uncertain, but it worked more often than not. The potion was passed around like sacred oil, doled out with warnings and hope. The healer kept brewing, kept praying, kept pretending she knew what she was doing. The dancing plague dwindled slowly. One by one, the afflicted were pulled out of the rhythm, slumped into silence, and returned to their families, shaken, limping, confused. But the memory remained, and so did the rumours. Some believed it was divine punishment for forgotten tithes or secret sins. Others thought it was the earth itself lashing out, revenge for trampled fields or burned trees. A few blamed sprites, fairies, or old gods whose names had been swallowed by time. Whatever it was, it left the village quieter, warier. For weeks afterward no one danced, not even the children. The fiddler tucked away his instrument. Where remained empty at dusk. Even the pig refused to prance. Until one evening, months later, a girl began humming, not the same tune, a different one, soft, familiar, a lullaby. She tapped her foot, just once, but nothing happened. She smiled, tapped again. Then someone clapped. Another whistled. A fiddler, perhaps his cousin, played a gentle reel. Slowly, cautiously, people gathered. No one spun, no one twirled, but they listened. And the music, quiet, delicate, afraid, floated into the night like it was testing the sky for curses. That was the legacy of the dancing sickness. Not just fear, but reverence. People danced again eventually, but never the same way. Movements were smaller, joy more deliberate. Every skipped step held a trace of caution. Every footfall was an echo of the madness. They called it mania. They called it enchantment. They called it demons, bad grain, witchcraft, exhaustion, or just bad luck. But no one ever really knew. The explanation didn't matter as much as the memory, because nothing spread faster than rhythm. Nothing infected more completely than movement without meaning. And nothing lingered longer than a song you couldn't stop dancing to. A song you couldn't stop dancing to. That was what they feared most. Not war, not wolves, not famine or fire. It was the idea that the body might betray the will, that a person could lose command over their limbs, over time, over self, and become nothing more than motion. The thought that joy, when detached from choice, could become terror. It changed how they moved, how they celebrated, even how they mourned. Feasts no longer ended in unrestrained dances but in quiet hymns and steady clapping. Weddings became more ritual than revelry. The children were still wild, of course. Children always are. But even they stopped their spinning games when an adult cast a glance that held more memory than words. Still, humans forget. That's what they're best at. Time softens terror, turns it into story, into shadow. Soon the tale of the 12 dances became a cautionary whisper, then a game, then a joke told after too much ale. Careful, or she'll dance you into the grave. Laughter followed, nervous but real. Then came the monks. Not from the local monastery, but a distant abbey known for its obsession with divine signs. They'd heard of the dancing sickness, travelled weeks to investigate it. When they arrived, hooded, pale, hungry for evidence, they brought with them scrolls, candles, and questions no one could answer. They interviewed the healer, demanded her recipe, asked about lunar phases and planetary positions. She answered what she could, refused what she wouldn't, and mocked what she didn't believe in. One monk asked if the villagers had been engaging in unholy rituals. She said yes, they'd boiled cabbage after sundown. He did not appreciate the sarcasm. They stayed for days, examining the square, the soil, the people. They sniffed the flour, interrogated the chickens, even tried to question Hamiel the pig, who bit one of their robes and earned himself a moment of accidental sainthood. Their final conclusion, mass possession. The villagers disagreed, politely, then not so politely, then with a parade of pitchforks that stopped just short of contact. The monks left in a hurry, robes flapping like offended geese. One dropped a scroll, which the children later used to wrap apples. Despite their departure, the fear remained, not of demons, but of repetition. They worried it might return, like a forgotten illness or an unpaid debt. So they developed precautions, not official, not written, but understood. Unspoken rules of rhythm. Don't dance alone at night. Don't hum unfamiliar tunes on feast days. Don't tap your feet for too long. Most followed them. Most believed, or wanted to. There was a boy named Hal, curious, stubborn, with the kind of mind that chewed through silence like mice through grain. He wasn't there during the sickness. He'd been born a year later, in a room that still smelled faintly of ash and time. But he heard the stories. He asked questions, too many questions. What did it feel like? Why did it start? Could it happen again? His mother told him to hush. His father swatted the back of his head and told him to sweep. The healer said it was nothing to chase, that some songs were better forgotten. But Hal didn't want to forget. He wanted to understand. So he built his own fiddle. It wasn't good. The strings were made from thread. The bow was half a feather tied to a stick. But he played it anyway, badly, deinously, defiantly. He wandered to the edge of the fields, to the abandoned corners of the village, and scraped out melodies that made even the crows look annoyed. One evening he played near the river. A girl joined him, then a second. They didn't dance, not at first. They swayed, then spun, slowly, hesitantly. And then someone shouted from the path, an old man with a limp and too many memories. He dropped the basket he was carrying and ran to them, screaming to stop, to run, to burn the fiddle, to silence the sound. Hal froze. So did the girls. The old man fell to his knees, sobbing, not with rage, but with terror, the kind that lives just beneath the skin, waiting for a reason to rise. That night, the fiddle vanished. Burned, maybe. Buried. Or hidden by someone who loved the boy enough to keep him from chasing madness. Not publicly, but he still listened. Every creak of a cart, every whistle of wind through the beams, every footfall in the square, he treated them like notes. He tapped rhythms against stones, whistled under his breath, drummed his fingers when he thought no one saw. Because the truth was, the dance never truly disappeared. It just changed shape. Later, people would say that every village had a little madness buried beneath its soil. Some had laughter, some had sorrow, and some had rhythm. And in the quietest moments when no one else was watching, that rhythm rose. In the flick of a broom, in the patter of rain, in the way someone tapped a spoon against a pot while waiting for stew to boil. It crept back, softly, slowly, just enough to remind them. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the dancing sickness wasn't a curse or a plague or a punishment. Maybe it was a reminder that joy without control becomes chaos. That movement, when untethered from choice, can turn on you. But also, that joy, even when feared, refuses to die. They feared the dance because they loved it. They punished rhythm because it once betrayed them. But beneath all of that fear, something deeper stirred. Something human. Because even after all that had happened, even after bruised feet, broken rules, and bent memories, they still tapped their toes when the bread came out warm, still swayed when someone sang a lullaby in the fields, still hummed old songs under their breath, pretending they'd forgotten the words. The dance had never been destroyed, only buried. And buried things, in the medieval world, never stayed down for long. Buried things, in the medieval world, never stayed down for long! Which is why, even in a place where dancing had once turned dangerous and laughter occasionally masked terror, stories continued to bloom like weeds in spring. You couldn't kill them! Couldn't outlaw them, couldn't even finish them properly, passed from mouth to mouth, warping with every retelling, each version shinier or darker than the last, depending on who told it and how many drinks they'd had before starting. And in every medieval village, there were specialists in this art, not officials, not elected, they simply were. Old women with sharp tongue, guy, toothless men who never worked but always leaned just close enough to listen, the ones who sat by the well or outside the tavern or by the fire at night, weaving fact into fiction and back again without missing a breath. These were the tale-bearers, goths, the story weavers, the unofficial scribes of mud-soaked history, and they were far more powerful than any priest or reeve, because they controlled what people remembered and how they remembered it. Take the tale of Lady Isbeth's ghost. By all practical accounts, Isbeth was never a lady. She was a barmaid with a limp and an incredible ability to balance 6 mugs of ale on her head. But after she passed, under perfectly mundane circumstances, someone whispered that she'd been seen walking through the orchard at night, clutching a glowing mug and singing in a language no one could identify. From there, it spiraled. One child claimed to have heard her tapping on his window. Another said she followed him all the way to the outhouse humming. A third insisted she'd appeared in his stew. By the time a week had passed, the tavern was selling a drink called Isbeth's Whisper. It was terrible, but people ordered it anyway. No one truly believed it, but no one wanted to be the one who didn't. That was the beauty of medieval gossip. It wasn't meant to be confirmed. It was meant to be shared. Sometimes it came in the form of murmurs, like the ones traded while hanging laundry or sweeping stoops. Did you hear about the miller's apprentice? No, but I heard about the midwife's cousin. They say he hasn't been seen since the rooster started wearing boots. Nothing made sense. Nothing had to. Because gossip wasn't about truth. It was about participation. If you repeated it, you belonged. The best stories, the ones with staying power, were rarely about heroes. They were about accidents, embarrassments, gone, unexplainable disappearances and pies gone missing in the night, about things that couldn't be checked because the person involved had gone to visit an uncle in the next village and wouldn't be back for months. Then, of course, there were the minstrels. Travellers with stringed instruments, long scarves, and the emotional stability of a particularly moody turnip. They wandered from village to village, spinning tales in song form. Some were brilliant. Others were disasters. Most fell somewhere in between. They were treated with both awe and suspicion, welcomed because they brought news, songs, and distractions. Watched closely because they tended to leave with someone's boots, blanket, or daughter. One named Older arrived just after the harvest, smelling of smoke and fennel, with a lute that had clearly seen war. Introduced himself by falling off his donkey and declaring the ground had moved first. That evening, he stood in the tavern and sang a song about a knight who fell in love with a dragon disguised as a shepherd. By the second verse, the villagers were silent. By the fourth, they were laughing. By the end, someone gave him a warm pie and asked him to stay. He didn't, of course. Minstrels never stayed. But before he left, he taught 3 boys how to rhyme insults and 2 girls how to spin a chorus so catchy that, weeks later, cows were still being named after it. His legacy wasn't a monument or a record, it was an echo, a tune stuck in a thatched roof, a name scratched into a bench, a baby named Alderine who would later claim to dream in riddles. Oh, minstrels weren't always welcome, though. If they told the wrong tale, mocked the wrong marriage, or hinted too loudly at the reeve's fondness for goats, they'd find themselves ushered out of town by way of buckets and bruised fruit. Even then, their songs lingered, because once a story was heard, it became yours, whether you liked it or not. And sometimes the best stories didn't come from minstrels or gossips, but from the walls themselves. People carved their secrets into wood, scratched initials into stone, drew crude pictures in soot on the back of ovens. One woman had an entire conversation with her neighbour by etching symbols into the side of her chicken coop, each one a code they'd made up as children. Years passed, husbands came and went, but the coop spoke the same language, decade after decade. This, too, was storytelling, quiet, private, etched rather than spoken. It wasn't always gentle. Some stories ruined reputations, drove people out, marked homes with symbols that meant unclean or unwanted. A girl caught kissing behind the granary might find her name turned into a rhyme. A boy who cried during a thunderstorm could become a cautionary tale told to goats. But even the cruel stories had a strange sort of tenderness buried inside them, because to be the subject of gossip was to matter, to be woven into the tapestry of village life, to become a thread others noticed. It was better, many believed, to be whispered about than ignored completely, and so the stories flowed through lips, through string songs, through scratched barn doors and clinking mugs. Some survived a single night, others stretched for generations. The oldest tales were no longer stories at all, but beliefs held with the same reverence as scripture and just as much creative interpretation. The village became a library with no shelves. Every resident a page, every porch a chapter. No one remembered everything, but someone always remembered something. And so history marched on, not with drums or scrolls, but with a wink, a whisper, and a rhyme that ended in something vaguely rude about someone's uncle. A rhyme that ended in something vaguely rude about someone's uncle. That's how memory worked, in a medieval village, anchored not in fact, but in rhythm, in laughter, in the strange stickiness of a half-true tale. And it wasn't only people who carried these stories. Objects remembered too. A stool wasn't just a stool. It was the seat where old man Boren once fell asleep mid-sermon and snored through half the priest's reading. Doorway wasn't just an entry. It was the place where a travelling merchant tricked, spilled his flour, and invented the phrase "toast bread" after rats chewed the sack into holy shapes. The cracked edge of a well might have been worn by elbows or by the steady press of women gossiping with their weight leaned in and secrets held close. Even the wind carried its own tone, curling around the eaves in winter with the same sound. Villagers swore they'd heard the night Anwen gave birth to twins who never cried. No one could prove it meant anything, but it meant something. That was the point. Story lived everywhere, and the people knew how to listen. Gossip wasn't idleness, it was preservation. It recorded who held tune during the last frost, who had an affair, who might have seen something strange in the woods, and the gossipers were archivists in disguise. Not all were women, but all had the uncanny ability to extract meaning from a sigh or read an entire narrative in the way a man looked at his boots too long before speaking. It was said Bertha, yes, oh Kate Bertha, once rebuilt the entire tale of a marriage falling apart just from watching a couple walk home in silence, 4 feet apart. By the next morning, 3 neighbours knew. By noon, so did the priest. That evening, the wife came to her husband with tea, not accusations. They never spoke of it. But they sat closer after that. The stories didn't always help. But they warned, they reminded, they stitched the edges of community tighter, one awkward anecdote at a time. Minstrels understood this better than most. They weren't just entertainers, they were mirrors held up to each village like a challenge. Their songs weren't only about kings and knights. Best ones were about you, or someone close enough to you that it stung. One particularly bold minstrel named Fen brought a 3-stringed harp and a mouth that never stopped. He sang of a village where the cows wore hats, the mayor was a goose in disguise, and a girl fell in love with her reflection in a puddle. It was absurd, brilliant, and too accurate. The crowd laughed, some loudly, some with the tight kind of smile that hides discomfort, because everyone in the village knew exactly who he was singing about. Fen never returned to that village, but the puddle girl became legend, and the goose mare made it onto 2 carved walking sticks, a tapestry, and, somehow, a loaf of bread shaped like a beak. Ridicule wasn't always cruel. In fact, most villagers preferred to be teased in song than ignored in silence. To be part of a joke was to be known, to be acknowledged, even if your role was drunkest man at the last feast or woman most likely to kiss the wrong brother. Gosh, some stories resisted sharing. Some people refused to let themselves become punchlines. There was Elric, the gravedigger. Tall, silent, and rarely clean. He never spoke unless addressed, and even then only with single words. But everyone knew he once sang lullabies to the bones. They weren't sure if it was out of respect or madness. Either way, no one joked about Elric. When he passed, they buried him with his shovel and 3 pebbles, one for each secret he was rumoured to have kept. The priest didn't ask why. He simply nodded. Then there was Miller, the baker's cousin, who claimed to dream other people's futures. Some swore she once predicted a wedding and a cow's death in the same sentence. Both occurred within 2 days. Others said she was full of nonsense. Either way, she was never left out of any gathering, just in case she said something worth remembering. That's how status worked in a village. Without gold or titles, you earned it by being talked about, by planting your feet so firmly in people's minds that they couldn't forget you even if they tried, and this culture of storytelling bled into everything. Children were taught morals not from books but from exaggerations. Don't steal, or you'll end up like Harnwick, who grew a second nose from guilt. There was no Harnwick, no second nose. Guy, but it worked. Even disputes were handled with narrative. If 2 farmers argued over a fence, the local crone might settle it, not with measurements, but with a tale about a time 2 men fought over a tree that turned out to be a disguised witch. The story didn't solve the boundary issue, but by the time it ended, both men were embarrassed enough to compromise, because shame could be scalding, but mockery could melt steel. And when everything else failed, there was song, not minstrel songs, but the low, local kind, the ones hummed while kneading dough, that chants used to scare away bad luck from the goat pen, the rhythm of laundry slapping stone, or wheat sheaves stacked in verses only the body remembered. One such song described how to test if someone was a liar. It involved chickens, moonlight, and a spoon. The logic was non-existent, but the song was catchy. More importantly, it made people laugh. And laughter was a form of truth, more reliable than any oath, because in the end, stories held the village together. They weren't always pretty. Often they were messy, contradictory, full of holes and suspicious details. But they endured. And in a world where buildings crumbled, crops failed, and winter stole lives without apology, endurance was everything. No one knew who told the first story. No one would ever tell the last. They just kept talking, kept listening, kept remembering. And long after the fires burned low, after the pigs had settled and the chickens had stopped their midnight shuffling, someone, somewhere, would lean over and whisper, "Did I ever tell you about the time the priest mistook a broom for a sinner?" Just like that, the world would begin again. And just like that, the world would begin again. This time with a pair of bones tossed on a barrel lid and a wager mumbled between mouthfuls of cider. That's how most games began in the medieval village. Not with grand decorations or elaborate setups, but with a sideways glance, a muttered challenge, and the sudden clatter of dice that might decide someone's dinner or doom. Because if stories kept people woven together, it was games that pulled the threads taut. And no game, in any form, existed in isolation. It came with stakes, always. A cup of mead, a loaf of bread, a chicken, a favour, a secret, or, when desperation set in, your shoes, or your dignity. It didn't take much. A pair of carved dice, slightly misshapen and probably whittled during a long winter by a man who claimed the number 7 existed if you squinted. A board scratched into the tavern table, worn soft by elbows and spilled drinks. A pile of stones, one flatter than the others, declared the king piece simply because no one dared argue with the blacksmith who picked it. The rules? They changed by village, by season, by who was currently winning. In one version of the dice game, 3 twos beat everything. In another, 3 twos meant you had to sing a confession or chase the innkeeper's dog in apology. But everyone agreed on this. When the dice rolled, the devil watched. Not literally, not even superstitiously most of the time. But there was an understanding, whispered, smirked, half-believed that luck had a price. Too much winning, and eyes would narrow. Too many losses, and someone would suggest your soul was worth less than the bones you kept throwing. The villagers didn't gamble like nobles did, with gold or lands or marriages on the line. They gambled with time, with scraps of food, with who would carry water for a week, or who had to tell the priest they were the one who borrowed his belt to trap a runaway pig. And somehow these games became rituals, especially in winter, when the dark lingered longer than it should, and people needed more than fire to feel alive. Whole evenings would vanish into laughter, curses, and chants of "Roll again, coward," followed by the shuffle of feet as someone stood, defeated, to fetch the next round of ale. But games weren't confined to tables or taverns. Outside, in the streets and fields, the rules changed, but the stakes remained. There was stone kicking, which involved lining up smooth rocks and seeing who could launch theirs, the farthest using only the heel of their boot. Simple, brutal, surprisingly violent. One cobbler made a fortune after a particularly intense spring, when half the village showed up needing replacement souls. He denied sponsoring the tournament, but the smugness never left his face for weeks. Then there was stick balance, played atop fences or barrels, or, once, a very cooperative cow. Players had to walk the length of a narrow beam while balancing a wooden spoon filled with beans. Whoever dropped the most beans had to eat them later, cold, off the floor, with witnesses. Children invented their own games, of course. Most involved mud, some involved bugs, and all involved yelling. One favourite was witch or wife, where someone spun in circles while others shouted absurd scenarios. If they collapsed face first, they were a witch. If they landed on their back, a wife, and if they landed in the firewood stack, they were declared a prophet and given the evening off from chores. But no game stirred suspicion more than cards. Not the ornate kind nobles played. These were made from scraps of parchment, or even flattened scraps of bark, with symbols drawn in charcoal and corners smudged from nervous fingers. The villagers called them whispers, because it was said each card carried a mood, some luck, some anger, some longing. When laid out in certain patterns, they didn't just predict your fate, they tempted it. A woman named Ilsa once laid down 3 blackened cards and declared the outcome to be the return of something lost. Her neighbour scoffed, until her long-missing goat wandered back the next morning, dragging a broken fence post and looking deeply offended by the entire ordeal. Another man saw the symbol of the broken cup and was bitten by his own dog before nightfall. Coincidence? Probably. But in villages where every creak of wood or flicker of candle meant something, coincidences were rarely left alone. This is why the priest hated cards more than any other game. Dice he could handle. Even the drunken races around the church well made him sigh rather than sermonize. But cards were dangerous. They encouraged questions. They offered glimpses. And glimpses could unravel belief faster than heresy. He preached against them 3 Sundays in a row. Ilsa responded by painting her deck in flower dye and calling it the gospel, according to Leaves. When asked what that meant, she smiled and said, "Whatever scares you the most." Some games, though, were pure mischief. There was the annual Guess What's in This Pie competition, where villagers brought suspicious pastries filled with increasingly dubious ingredients. The rules were simple. Eat a slice, guess 2 ingredients. If you got one right, you were safe. If you got none, you had to sing a song of apology to the pie and its creator. One year, the baker's son filled a pie with mashed turnip, mint, and a small brass button. No one guessed. The resulting song was so bad the pigs ran away from the village for 2 days. Still, it was all consensual chaos. No one was truly harmed, not usually, except during Midsummer Mayhem, a game that involved blindfolds, ribbons, and trying to tag someone by yelling their name while being spun in a circle first. Fun until someone tags the blacksmith's anvil by mistake and loses 3 teeth. The game paused for 1 year after that. Only one. But through it all, through the splinters, the bruises, the suspicious pies and cursed dice, there was one constant. Everyone kept playing. Because games weren't about winning. Not really. They were about friction, about stakes, even tiny ones. About watching your neighbour try something stupid and thinking, "I could do worse," and then doing exactly that. It was how boredom was beaten back, how grudges were softened, how pride was checked and egos humbled, one ridiculous loss at a time. And when the games ended, when the dice were packed away and the spoons wiped clean and the last bean eaten off the floor, people walked home a little lighter, a little sore maybe, but closer, because nothing bonded a village like shared humiliation. And in the medieval world, laughter was the prize no one ever wagered, but everyone won. Laughter was the prize no one ever wagered, but everyone won. And still the dice kept rolling. After the tavern lamps were dimmed and most villagers had gone home, the true gamblers stayed behind, lingering like smoke in the rafters. They played in whispers now, hunched over the sticky tables, eyes sharp despite the ale. These late-night sessions were where reputations were made, where debts quietly changed hands, and where the devil's presence, imagined or not, felt thickest in the room. The rules grew stranger as the hours stretched thin. Someone suggested playing backwards, announcing throws in reverse order. Another declared that any dice that fell to the floor belonged to the saints and must be kissed before being retrieved. A farmer swore that if you blew across the table 3 times before a throw, you could force destiny to blink. Whether anyone believed him hardly mattered. The ritual itself became a kind of music, each superstition another beat in the midnight rhythm. It was in these hours that the stakes quietly shifted. Coins were rare, but favours were endless. A night of water hauling, a week of firewood chopping, a secret carried to the grave. Some wagers were ridiculous. One man promised to moo like a cow at the next Sunday service if he lost, but some were dangerous. A borrowed tool here, a promise of silence there. In a world where a single rumour could decide a marriage or ruin a harvest contract, silence was a currency more valuable than silver. The priest claimed to patrol these games to guard souls, but everyone knew he came to listen. More than once he left the tavern humming a tune from the gambler's chants, shaking his head as though the melody had slipped past his defences. He never played, or so he said. Yet the dice always seemed warmer after his visits. Not all play happened in shadows. Festivals brought their own daylight contests, and with them the sly art of public wagering. During midsummer fairs, villagers lined the green with makeshift booths where every action could be turned into a bet. How high the goat would jump, how long the fiddler could hold a single note, how many turnips a blindfolded child could throw through the mill window before someone noticed. Every guess carried a coin, a cake, or a promise. Every outcome sparked either triumph or mock outrage. Even those who claimed to hate gambling found themselves sucked into the noise, drawn by the pulse of collective risk. The boldest players graduated to the Great Dice Circle, a yearly spectacle held after harvest when bellies were full and pockets slightly heavier. Here, dice the size of a man's fist were carved from oak and rolled across packed earth. Spectators shouted prayers, insults, and advice, believing that words themselves could tip fate. The sound of those wooden cubes striking the ground deep, hollow, final, was said to echo all the way to the next village. Winners strutted home with sacks of grain or borrowed goats. Losers wore wreaths of nettles to mark their shame, though most laughed even as the stinging leaves raised welts. Yet for all its cheer, the circle had a darker edge. Old stories told of players who grew addicted to the rattle of dice, who wagered their winter stores and lost, who sold their own labour for months to repay a reckless throw. One tale spoke of a man who bet the naming rights of his unborn child and spent the rest of his life explaining why his son answered to 66. Parents used these legends as warnings, but the thrill remained irresistible. Risk was a fire everyone wanted to feel, even if only for a heartbeat. Card games carried their own brand of danger. The homemade decks, smudged and warped, were said to reveal more than numbers. A crooked draw might foretell a failed harvest, a sudden illness, a secret love. Players leaned over the cards as if the future really did sit inside those stained pieces of bark. Sometimes it felt as though it did. A woman once drew 3 identical marks in a row and burst into tears before anyone explained the odds. She claimed she'd seen her dead brother's shadow behind the symbols. No one laughed. The cards were burned before dawn. Children absorbed these lessons early. They played miniature versions in the dirt, using pebbles as dice and scraps of cloth as cards. They learned that luck was fickle, that cheers could turn to jeers in a heartbeat, that a well-timed bluff could win more than brute strength. These games were their training ground for the subtler contests of adult life: marriage bargains, harvest negotiations, quiet rivalries masked by polite nods. Even animals were drawn into the frenzy. Rooster races became a favoured pastime, with villagers laying bets on which bird would strut across the square fastest. Pigs were greased and released, their frantic squeals echoing against stone walls as children chased them for prize ribbons. Goats, unpredictable and occasionally violent, were fitted with coloured cloths and turned loose in guessing games that ended in overturned carts and bruised shins. Every creature became a participant, every outcome a story waiting to be retold by the well the next morning. As night deepened and the moon cast its pale challenge across the rooftops, the village eventually exhaled. Dice were pocketed, cards stacked, wagers sealed with handshakes sticky from cider. Victors carried home their spoils, a loaf of bread, a neighbour's promise, the sweet weight of a secret kept. Losers trudged through mud with empty hands, but hearts still quickened by the thrill of chance. No one left unchanged. The games were small, the prizes humble, but each throw of the dice reminded them that fate could be touched, teased, maybe even tricked, if only for a moment, and that, more than any coin or cake, was the real reward. Because in a world ruled by weather, plague, and the whims of distant kings, the villagers of the medieval night discovered something rare. For a few breathless minutes, fortune felt like theirs to command. And when the dice were finally pocketed and the wagers forgotten, the village needed something different, something less about chance and more about spectacle. That need gave birth to their greatest shared obsession, theatre. Not the velvet-draped stages of royal courts, but a stubborn, mud-flecked, wildly improvised theatre that belonged entirely to the people. It began simply. A storyteller would stand on a cart and mimic voices while neighbours clapped along. Soon a bench became a throne, a broken bucket, a crown. Before long, whole evenings were devoted to transforming the square into a stage where bakers, farmers, and goat herders played kings, demons, saints, and skeletons. No ticket sellers, no curtains, just imagination, nerve, and the faint smell of cabbage drifting in from the supper pots. The favourite shows were mystery plays, loose retellings of Bible stories or local legends with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Adam and Eve argued like an old married couple. Noah forgot half the animals and improvised with whatever children were nearby. Angels wore flour sacks for wings and occasionally tripped over the well. The audience loved every mishap, laughing louder when the miracle failed than when it worked. But it was the death plays that drew the largest crowds. These performances, half sermon and half carnival, reminded everyone that life was short and unpredictable, a truth villagers already knew too well, but never tired of exploring. A young man would paint his face bone white, don a tattered cloak, and stalk the stage as the personification of death. He would interrupt weddings, bargain with farmers, whisper into the ears of children who squealed in delighted fear. The script changed every year. The ending never did. Death always won. Some actors treated the role as a solemn duty, bowing slowly and speaking in careful rhymes. Others turned it into dark comedy, juggling skull-shaped turnips and chasing the village priest in mock terror. The priest pretended outrage, but everyone noticed he always lingered near the stage, secretly enjoying the chance to spar with his inevitable adversary. Villagers volunteered eagerly for supporting roles. A blacksmith might play a doomed knight one night, and a gossiping villager the next. Children acted as spirits, darting between the legs of adults with shrieks that made even the bravest stumble. Costumes came from whatever could be stolen from laundry lines. A shawl became royal robes, a pig's bladder inflated into a fearsome prop heart, a worn broom crowned as the staff of destiny. Preparation for these plays turned the village into a buzzing workshop. By day, women dyed rags with beetroot for dramatic bloodstains, while men hammered planks into wobbly platforms. By evening, rehearsals spilled into every corner, behind barns, in the shadow of the church, even atop the cheese-rolling hill where actors practiced lines while dodging curious goats. Arguments were common, over lines, over props, over who got to faint most dramatically, but the disputes always ended with shared ale and laughter. The performances themselves were chaotic masterpieces. Torches smoked, actors forgot their words, and dogs wandered onto the stage at the worst possible moments. Once, during a climactic death scene, the corpse sneezed so loudly the audience roared, and the priest declared it a miracle of resurrection. Another time, The character of Death tripped over a hidden cabbage and tumbled into the well, climbing out soaked but triumphant, declaring, "Even I cannot escape this village's plumbing." Audiences came from neighbouring hamlets to witness the fun. They brought bread, ale, and gossip, trading news while waiting for the next act. Travellers often claimed these rough performances carried more heart than the polished pageants of distant cities. Here, the stories belonged to everyone. A farmer could rewrite a saint's dialogue on the spot. A child could interrupt to ask why angels didn't wear shoes, and the actor would answer in character while the crowd howled. These plays weren't mere entertainment. They were lessons disguised as chaos. Between the pratfalls and improvised jokes lay sharp reminders. Death visits kings and beggars alike. Pride leads to folly. Love outlasts even the coldest winter. People left the square not just laughing, but thinking about neighbours, about choices, about the fragile thread that held each life together. Theatre also served as a quiet rebellion. When taxes rose, or a lord's decree felt heavy, actors slipped sly barbs into dialogue. A fool might describe a greedy king whose crown smelled of turnips, and the crowd would laugh a little too loudly. Lords rarely attended, but their messengers did, and the jokes travelled faster than any horse. It was a way to speak truth in a world where direct complaint could bring punishment. A crooked rhyme could carry a sharper blade than any sword. After the final bow, when the torches burned low and the actors wiped soot from their cheeks, the village returned to ordinary night. Costumes were folded back into laundry baskets, props tossed into sheds, and the stage, if one could call it that, reverted to mud and silence. Yet for days afterward the stories lingered. Children reenacted scenes in the fields. Farmers quoted lines while trading grain. Lovers borrowed the death speeches to make their confessions sound grander. And somewhere in the darkness, perhaps behind a shuttered window or beneath the eaves of the church, someone began sketching next year's script on a scrap of wood, already imagining the gasp of the crowd when Death once again stepped forward to claim the final word. But the crowd never waited quietly for next year. The morning after a performance, the village square transformed into a kind of living review page where every passerby became a critic. Farmers hauling milk debated which actor fainted most convincingly. Children argued over whether the goat that wandered on stage had been part of the script. Old Bertha swore she saw the priest hiding a grin when Deaf Mock threatened to collect unpaid tithes. Each conversation added another layer to the story, turning last night's chaos into a shared memory polished with every retelling. Actors basked in the attention even while pretending modesty. The boy who played Death lingered near the well, soaking up sideways glances and offers of leftover bread. He'd spent the night washing soot from his hair, but a faint grey tint clung stubbornly to his skin, giving him the look of someone half returned from the grave. Children followed him like ducklings, daring each other to touch the hem of his cloak, as though the role had permanently stained him with supernatural power. He responded with slow, deliberate turns of the head that sent them shrieking into the mud. Behind the laughter lay something more serious. The plays gave villagers a way to talk about mortality without the heavy silence that usually surrounded it. Death visited every household eventually, through sickness, accident, or the sudden cruelty of a bad harvest. On stage, that inevitability became something they could chase, mock, even bargain with. When the actor playing Death stumbled or forgot a line, the audience roared not just with humour, but with relief. For one evening at least, they had outwitted the darkness. The plays also served as a kind of training ground for emotions. The villagers rarely voiced in daily life. Lovers volunteered for tragic roles so they could rehearse grand speeches of devotion under the excuse of performance. Neighbours who feuded over grazing rights acted as allies or enemies depending on who signed up first, their scripted arguments softening real grievances. Even the priest, whose sermons warned against vanity, sometimes took a part for theological accuracy, which conveniently allowed him to wear a borrowed crown and deliver lines about divine justice while enjoying the cheers. Props from the productions took on second lives once the stage was cleared. The broom that served as a king's sceptre became a prized household relic, borrowed for weddings to sweep away ill fortune. Pig bladder hearts were dried and hung in barns as good luck charms. Children hid pieces of painted cloth beneath their pillows, believing they would bring dreams of angels, or at least of well-timed applause. Months later, a scrap of costume would resurface in a field or attic, and a whole afternoon would be lost to retelling the night it once shimmered in torchlight. Travelling merchants carried tales of these plays to other villages, sometimes embellishing them until the original performance sounded like a clash of armies or a visit from saints. When neighbouring hamlets staged their own versions, details morphed further. Death gained a pet raven, angels began juggling turnips, and one particularly bold troupe introduced a scene where the audience was invited to throw onions at the devil. Each retelling was both imitation and reinvention, proof that the stories belonged to no single voice. Winter brought a special kind of theatre. With nights long and work slowed by snow, villagers gathered inside the largest barn for shadow plays. A white sheet was stretched between two beams, behind which lanterns threw silhouettes of actors, animals, and whatever objects could be coaxed into strange shapes. Children gasped as wolves appeared enormous, and saints glowed like giants. The illusion was simple. A flick of the hand, a twist of cloth. But in the hush of winter darkness, it felt almost holy. These performances blurred the line between sacred and profane, lesson and laughter. A moral might be delivered in a clown's voice. A tragedy might end with a goat stealing the final line. But whether comic or sombre, the plays reinforced the one truth every villager carried in their bones. Life was fragile, unpredictable, and best faced together. When the torches dimmed and the stage dissolved back into mud, they returned to their chores not merely entertained but strengthened, their hearts steadied by the knowledge that even death could be mocked, if only for an evening. And as the last echoes of applause faded into the winter night, plans for the next performance were already beginning. Scribbled on scraps of parchment, whispered over steaming bowls of stew, hidden like sparks beneath the ash of daily life, waiting for the next gust of imagination to set them ablaze. And then came the season when imagination no longer needed a torch. It arrived on horseback with a crash of lances, the smell of roasted meat, and the reckless promise of a tournament. Word of a joust spread faster than any sermon. Before the first banner was even sown, children were fashioning makeshift lances from broom handles, and farmers were polishing the least broken of their stools to serve as grandstands. A proper tournament meant more than sport. It meant trade, feasting, flirting, and a temporary suspension of the everyday rules that kept a village stitched too tightly. The field outside the walls became an instant arena. Carts were dragged aside, hedges trampled flat, and rough wooden rails hammered into the mud until they leaned like tired soldiers. There were no velvet canopies or silk pennants here, only patched cloth dyed in beet juice and a handful of ribbons borrowed from weddings long past. Yet when the first armoured rider trotted into view, even the crooked rails seemed to straighten, as if the ground itself recognised the importance of spectacle. Knights from neighbouring shires arrived in mismatched armour, some dented from real battles, others polished to a theatrical gleam. Their horses snorted clouds of steam into the morning air, while children shrieked and mothers crossed themselves in half-serious prayer. Each rider carried a painted shield bearing symbols that looked heroic from a distance and slightly ridiculous up close. One favoured a turnip on a crimson field, another bore 3 awkward ducks. Heralds announced these emblems as though introducing kings, stretching each syllable until even the geese listened. When the lances lowered and the first charge began, the village square might as well have been a royal court. Hooves thundered. Mud flew. The wooden barrier groaned beneath the force of impact. A splintering crack followed by a roar of approval swept through the crowd as one knight's lance shattered across his opponent's shield. Victory was measured not in blood, but in drama. The bigger the break, the louder the cheer, and the greater the chance that someone would name a newborn after the winner before nightfall. Between tilts, the lists transformed into a carnival. Merchants hawked spiced ale from barrels that smelled faintly of goat. Bakers sold pies stuffed with mystery fillings that encouraged both gambling and indigestion. Jugglers tossed knives dangerously close to the crowd, while minstrels shouted improvised verses about the day's favourites, changing their rhymes mid-song whenever a new challenger impressed them. Children darted between legs with sticky fingers and pockets full of stolen nuts, while dogs launched daring raids on unattended platters of meat. The feasting began long before the joust ended. Huge cauldrons of stew bubbled at the edges of the field, thick with onions, leeks, and whatever game the hunters managed to snare that morning. Bread baked in outdoor ovens emerged with singed edges and a smell strong enough to silence arguments. Ale flowed until even the priest loosened his belt and joined the toasts, insisting it was only to keep the peace. Wooden mugs clinked like small thunder as neighbours traded boasts, bets, and sly invitations to meet behind the cider barrels once darkness fell. As evening deepened, contests shifted from horses to humans. Wrestling rings formed wherever the mud looked forgiving. Men locked arms and strained until their faces matched the sunset, while women shouted advice that was equal parts encouragement and insult. Drinking games followed, each more absurd than the last. Balancing mugs on one's head while reciting psalms, racing to drain a cup without using hands, guessing the ingredients of the suspicious punch that smelled faintly of candle wax. The losers were rewarded with more ale, which guaranteed further losses. Inevitably, revelry tipped into chaos. A playful shove near the stewpot became a full-scale mud brawl. Two rival minstrels challenged each other to a duel of insults so sharp the blacksmith begged for mercy. Somewhere near the animal pens, an ambitious goat escaped and charged through the crowd wearing a child's discarded wreath, instantly becoming the evening's unofficial champion. Every scuffle ended the same way, with laughter, aching ribs, and the slow realization that no one could remember who had started it in the first place. The tournament itself rarely crowned a single winner. Helmets cracked, horses tired, lances broke, and pride suffered bruises impossible to measure. But the villagers didn't care. What mattered was the shared exhaustion, the taste of roasted meat, the stories that would echo for months. Tomorrow the square would be muddy and silent, the makeshift rails already leaning back into the earth. Yet tonight, under a sky thick with smoke and stars, every villager, peasant, priest, or passing knight stood equal in the glow of torches and the reckless joy of a feast that belonged to all. By dawn the field looked less like a site of noble sport and more like the aftermath of a minor siege. Trampled grass steamed in the cool air, littered with broken lances, bent spoons, and the occasional shoe whose owner would spend the morning limping in search of it. The grand rails sagged like tired sentries, and a single gauntlet lay half buried in the mud, fingers curled as if still clutching one last wager. Crows hopped from splinter to splinter, inspecting the wreckage with the air of professional critics unimpressed by human spectacle. But the villagers were already awake, voices carrying through mist as they sorted the night's memories into stories worth keeping. Some swore the goat had truly won the final joust by sheer audacity. Others argued that the blacksmith's drunken wrestling victory counted as a miracle of physics. Children replayed their favourite moments with wild gestures. One boy claimed he had seen sparks fly from a knight's helmet. Another insisted the moon itself leaned closer to watch. The competitors emerged slowly, battered but unbowed. Armour clinked as dents were examined like battlefield scars, each one an invitation for exaggerated retellings. A rider whose lance had shattered on first contact described the break as a strategic withdrawal. Another, who spent half the tournament stuck in the mud, insisted he had been guarding the rear flank of an invisible army. Their boasts were accepted without question because truth was less valuable than entertainment. As the morning wore on, feasting gave way to reckoning. Bets placed in the heat of excitement came due. A farmer who had wagered his best goose reluctantly presented the bird to a triumphant neighbour, only to receive it back with a wink and a request for a shared stew. A young mason, having lost a contest of ale-chugging, spent the day reciting embarrassing verses to every passer-by. He began shyly, but soon performed with such flourish that even the priest tipped his hat in grudging admiration. The priest himself faced his own reckoning. Rumour spread that he had been seen clapping during the forbidden midnight dance that followed the final joust. He denied it with righteous vigour while discreetly brushing mud from his sandals. No one believed him, but no one pressed too hard. Everyone knew the line between piety and pleasure blurred easily when the drums began. As noon approached, the square once again became a market. Merchants who had arrived for the tournament laid out their goods. Knives polished to a dangerous shine, ribbons bright enough to tempt even the sternest grandmother, spiced honey cakes that left fingers sticky and hearts racing. Coins clinked, bargains were struck, and travellers traded tales of tournaments in other shires where knights supposedly licked flaming ditches or wrestled bears. Whether these feats were real mattered less than the widening of eyes and the laughter that followed. By afternoon, the energy shifted from celebration to something looser, almost reckless. Groups formed around half-empty barrels, inventing new contests on the spot. One involved balancing on a single foot while drinking from a tilted mug. Another required participants to whistle a hymn while swallowing pickled onions. Arguments erupted over rules no one bothered to write down. Every dispute ended the same way: another round of ale and a handshake sticky with honey cake. As shadows lengthened, music rose again, slower now but no less insistent. Couples swayed in uneven circles while children collapsed in giggling heaps. A knight with a bandaged arm played a borrowed lute, his clumsy chords somehow perfect against the fading light. The goat, still crowned with yesterday's wreath, wandered through the dances like a benevolent spirit, pausing to nibble a sleeve or inspect an unattended mug. When darkness finally claimed the field, the villagers carried their torches back toward the square. The tournament grounds were left to the night, muddy, littered, alive with echoes. Somewhere among the trampled grass, a broken lance gleamed faintly in the moonlight like a relic of battles that were never meant to be wars. Tomorrow the carts would reclaim the field, children would chase geese across the rails, and the memory of the feast would already be turning into legend. But for one brief span of hours, the village had stepped outside the ordinary, tasting the thrill of danger and the sweetness of reckless joy, and they would carry that warmth into the long winter nights ahead. Winter always drew people closer, whether they wished it or not. Cold pressed against timber walls. Snow muffled the fields, and the village shrank inward like a sleeping animal. It was a season of shared warmth of hearth-fires, heavy stews, and long evenings when conversation stretched further than daylight. And in those slow, dark hours, hearts wandered as restlessly as the wind beyond the shutters. Romance in the medieval village did not arrive with roses or elegant speeches. It crept in through small gestures, a loaf of bread left on a doorstep, a scarf forgotten at the well, a glance held half a heartbeat longer than politeness allowed. With daylight scarce, such signals carried the weight of entire letters. Yet letters came too, scribbled on scraps of parchment or thin slices of bark, inked with soot and the faint perfume of risk. You could write with elegance, but that rarely stopped them. A farmer might hire the village scribe to compose a love note, paying in eggs or ale. The scribe, often drunk and always dramatic, filled the page with exaggerated metaphors until a simple fondness for a neighbour's smile became a declaration of eternal devotion beneath the eyes of heaven. Delivery was an art in itself. Children acted as messengers, slipping folded tokens into baskets of grain or hiding them beneath mugs in the tavern. Sometimes a goat carried the note by accident, leaving a trail of hoofprints and confusion before the message finally reached its target. Bathhouses added another layer of intrigue. Unlike the private baths of distant cities, village bathhouses were communal, low wooden structures where steam rose in ghostly plumes and privacy dissolved with the frost. Families bathed together for warmth, but that did not prevent whispered rendezvous. Steam softened voices, blurred outlines, and provided perfect cover for stolen glances. A girl might brush a boy's hand while passing a ladle. A widow might linger near a married man's corner a little too long. Nothing explicit needed to happen. The mere possibility sent hearts pounding faster than any jousting match. Such encounters rarely stayed secret for long. Gossip flowed as freely as the bathwater. A single raised eyebrow at the well could spark an entire narrative by evening. Yet secrecy held its own charm. Lovers carved initials into the underside of benches or scratched cryptic symbols on the bathhouse beams, leaving clues only the intended could read. Decades later, those marks still puzzled children who imagined ancient codes of treasure rather than simple confessions of affection. Winter feasts provided the perfect stage for these quiet dramas. After the final prayers and the carving of meat, when mugs of hot ale passed from hand to hand, songs turned softer, and the corners of the hall dimmed into shadow. Couples slipped into those shadows, sharing hurried words or passing tiny gifts beneath the table, a polished stone, a ribbon, a dried sprig of rosemary said to protect lovers from envy. The bravest exchanged kisses behind the grain bins, hearts racing at the thought of discovery. For some, These stolen moments blossomed into marriages blessed by spring. For others, they remained only memories, half hidden like embers beneath cooling ash. Not all affairs were tender. Some were fueled by boredom, spite, or the intoxicating thrill of defiance. A miller might meet the cooper's wife in the barn under the excuse of checking grain. A widow might entertain two suitors at once, accepting gifts from both while promising neither. When jealousies flared, revenge often arrived in the form of song. Minstrels thrived on such material, weaving sly verses about a fox who borrowed 2 hen-houses, or a dove who nested in more than one tree. The guilty blushed, the crowd laughed, and the truth hid safely behind rhyme. Yet beneath the mischief lay a deeper truth. These connections, however secret or fleeting, helped the villagers survive the cold. Winter could be cruel long nights, thin stores, the constant shadow of illness. Love, even when messy, offered warmth no fire could match. A whispered promise, a shared mug of cider, the brush of a hand beneath a cloak. Each gesture defied the darkness outside and reminded them they were alive, desired, and human. When spring finally returned, many of these winter romances melted like snow, leaving behind nothing but memories and the faint scent of rosemary clinging to an old ribbon. Some, however, endured. Couples emerged from the season hand in hand, their affection hardened like iron in the cold. Weddings followed, celebrated with the same joyful chaos that marked every village gathering, music, feasting, and a final toast to the sly magic that thrived in the quiet heart of winter. But spring had a way of exposing what winter tried to hide. As the snow receded and paths turned to mud, secrets began to thaw right along with the soil. Letters forgotten in boots were discovered during cleaning. Carved initials once hidden beneath frost reappeared on benches, darkened by meltwater and sharper than when they were first scratched. Children, poking sticks into thawing earth, unearthed folded scraps of parchment that smelled faintly of smoke and regret. Each discovery became the spark for a new round of speculation that travelled faster than any migrating bird. The bathhouse, once shrouded in steam, now echoed with a different kind of heat. With windows thrown open to welcome the softer air, whispers could no longer hide behind clouds of vapour. Conversations meant for two drifted into the street where a passing goose or an eavesdropping child might carry them further. A single overheard name could start a chain of nods and knowing glances that reached the marketplace before noon. Some lovers tried to cover their tracks by claiming the winter gatherings were purely for warmth. No one believed them, but the fiction provided a polite surface over which the real stories could ripple unchecked. Festivals brought their own complications. The first May celebration, meant to honour the return of fertility to fields and families alike, became an unintentional stage for confessions. Couples who had spent the winter exchanging subtle glances now found themselves weaving ribbons around the same maypole, their hands brushing in front of half the village. Others avoided each other entirely, their careful distance speaking volumes. The priest delivered a sermon on chastity while standing beneath garlands of flowers that smelled of temptation. His words floated upward and dissolved into the spring breeze long before they could take root. Not every revelation ended in scandal. Some secret romances ripened into public courtships with surprising grace. A widow and the miller, who had shared late-night mugs of cider, now strolled openly through the square, their laughter no longer hidden by the creak of shutters. The baker's apprentice, who once slipped love notes into flour sacks, announced an engagement by presenting a loaf shaped like a heart, dense, misshapen, and perfect. These unions were celebrated with the usual blend of teasing and toasts, proof that even the most whispered beginnings could bloom into something sturdy once daylight returned. Others faced rougher landings. Promises made in the hush of winter sometimes withered in the glare of spring. A farmer who had written 3 identical letters to 3 different women found his luck evaporating as quickly as the last patches of snow. Each woman arrived at the well on the same morning, letters in hand, and read them aloud to an audience that doubled with every sentence. By evening the farmer's name had been immortalized in a bawdy drinking song, and he spent the next season carrying water for every household as penance. The minstrels arrived just in time to capture these dramas. Travelling through thawing roads with muddy boots and eager ears, they collected the freshest rumours and set them to music before the ink on the letters had fully dried. One lanky bard composed a ballad about a bathhouse phantom who stole hearts and towels in equal measure. Another sang of a mysterious Rose of the Frost, whose kisses left marks shaped like snowflakes. Everyone recognized the real people behind the metaphors, but polite laughter allowed truth and fiction to mingle without outright accusation. As evenings warmed, lovers reclaimed the outdoors. Fields that had been silent under ice now hosted twilight walks where conversations stretched like the lengthening shadows. Couples lingered by the river where frogs croaked their clumsy serenades. Some carved new initials into fresh bark, layering their declarations over the fading marks of last year's affairs. The forest became a library of overlapping romances, each tree trunk a chapter, each cut a reminder that desire could outlast even the harshest winter. Through it all, the village maintained its delicate balance between discretion and delight. Parents warned their children about temptation while quietly recalling their own youthful escapades. Grandmothers shook their heads at gossip, but never missed a single detail. Even the priest, who thundered about virtue on Sundays, was rumoured to smile faintly whenever he passed the bathhouse, as if amused by the eternal dance between caution and curiosity. By midsummer, the scandals of winter had settled into legend. Names once whispered became punchlines, and the sharp edges of jealousy dulled into affectionate teasing. Lovers who survived the season emerged stronger, their bonds tempered like iron in the forge of rumour. Those whose romances faded returned to ordinary friendship, carrying memories that would resurface only in the long evenings of another winter. And the village, ever hungry for stories, tucked each affair into the growing archive of tales that kept its nights alive. Because in a world where seasons ruled every rhythm, love followed its own unpredictable calendar, sprouting in frost, blooming in mud, and leaving behind marks that no thaw could completely erase. Summer arrived with a rush of warmth that seemed to lift the village onto its toes. After months of cramped rooms and whispered promises, people spilled into the open air as if the sun itself had flung the doors wide. Markets swelled, musicians tuned their battered instruments, and every narrow street smelled of bread, sweat, and the restless excitement that only long daylight could bring. It was festival season, the moment when the calendar itself loosened, and the rules of ordinary life softened like butter left too close to the hearth. Preparations began weeks in advance. Children collected wildflowers and wove them into garlands until every goat and goose wore a crown. Blacksmiths hammered extra nails for temporary stages and trestle tables. The brewer tripled his batches, muttering blessings over barrels as if beer alone kept the heavens turning. Even the priest, who grumbled about excess, secretly set aside his best sandals for the evening processions. Everyone knew these festivals were more than entertainment. They were a declaration of survival, proof that the community had endured another cycle of cold and scarcity and was ready to laugh in the face of uncertainty once again. The first night opened with fire. Torches lined the square, their flames tossing gold across the crooked roofs and sending sparks spiralling into the dark like messages to forgotten gods. At the centre of the green stood the great bonfire, built from weeks of scavenged wood and decorated with ribbons that fluttered like restless spirits. When the flames finally leapt skyward, a roar rose from the crowd, a sound of relief, challenge, and sheer joy. Children darted close enough to feel the heat and then shrieked as parents hauled them back. Lovers used the flicker to hide shy smiles. Old men warmed their hands and pretended not to remember how many such fires they had already survived. Around the blaze the games began. Fortune-tellers set up tables draped in cloth dyed the colour of twilight, offering glimpses of tomorrow for the price of a coin or a well-kept secret. Some read cards, others shells, or the patterns of ash that drifted from the bonfire. Predictions were vague enough to fit any future. A journey will change you, a gift will arrive when the moon is thin, but the villagers listened with wide eyes all the same. To hear that love might bloom or luck might turn was to feel, if only for a heartbeat, that destiny could be bargained with. Musicians followed, filling the square with a music that was half rhythm, half riot. Drums thudded like eager hearts while flutes chased the melody through alleys and over rooftops. Feet found the beat without permission. Farmers stamped in heavy boots. Children spun until they toppled into the grass, and grandmothers clapped along with hands gnarled from decades of harvests. No one asked who led the dance. The music simply moved through the crowd like a warm current, carrying everyone with it. As the night deepened, foolishness became the festival's true language. Men competed to balance mugs of ale on their heads, while reciting riddles that grew more incoherent with every sip. Women tied bells to the ankles of sleeping dogs, and bet on how long it would take for the animals to notice. A travelling juggler convinced half the crowd that he could catch sparks from the fire in his bare hands, only to reveal fistfuls of glowing beetles that lit the night with their tiny lantern bodies. Laughter rolled across the square in waves, each peal chasing away the lingering chill of winter like a flock of noisy birds. Not every prank stayed harmless. A group of daring youths attempted to leap the outer ring of the bonfire for bragging rights. Some cleared it cleanly to wild cheers. Others landed in the soot and emerged looking like startled chimney sweeps. The healer stood ready with ointments, shaking her head at their bravado while secretly admiring the courage it took to fly so close to flame. Each leap, each stumble, became instant legend, guaranteed a place in tomorrow's gossip and next year's festival boasts. Amid the noise, quieter moments unfolded. Couples slipped away to the edge of the fields where the firelight faded into starlight. There, promises were whispered that might outlast the night or dissolve with the morning dew. Exchanged small gifts, a ribbon, a carved button, a handful of roasted nuts, as tokens of the bond forged in shared revelry. Even the solitary found company in the rhythm of drums, and the simple act of watching sparks rise into a sky so crowded with stars it seemed to pulse with life. By the time the fire burned low, the village had transformed. Faces glowed with sweat and smoke, clothing smelled of ash and ale, and every heart beat with the knowledge that, for one night at least, they had defied darkness together. The bonfire's final embers settled into the earth like seeds, promising that the stories born in its light would sprout in conversations for weeks to come. Morning arrived, slow and smoky, a soft grey light revealing a square littered with the confetti of human excess. Ash drifted across half-extinguished logs. Ribbons lay tangled in puddles like exhausted snakes. Empty mugs rolled in lazy circles each time a breeze wandered through. The air carried the sweet, sour perfume of spilled ale and trampled herbs, a scent that clung to clothes long after washing. Crows strutted through the debris like self-appointed inspectors, picking at crumbs and announcing their findings with sharp, satisfied cries. Despite the wreckage, the villagers woke early. Sleep was a luxury no one wanted when there were stories to relive. Groups formed wherever the sun touched the cobblestones, each knot of people building a different version of the night. Children boasted of daring leaps over flames that had in reality been no higher than a bread loaf. Teenagers swore they had danced until the stars themselves blurred, though their muddied boots told of more falling than flying. Elders nodded through the accounts, adding sly corrections or deliberate exaggerations until truth and invention became impossible to separate. The fortune-tellers, who had disappeared before dawn like spirits retreating with the darkness, became the focus of much debate. Some villagers swore the predictions had already begun to unfold. A brewer claimed the mysterious traveller had promised him a windfall of golden foam, and indeed one of his barrels had burst in the night, spilling a river of ale that soaked an entire row of benches. Others insisted their fortunes were still waiting to reveal themselves and treated every squeak of a door hinge or sudden bird call as an omen. Merchants counted their earnings while pretending to lament the state of the square. The juggler bragged that his glowing beetles had inspired 3 marriage proposals and at least 1 theological argument. The priest, his eyes rimmed with smoke and sleeplessness, attempted a homily about moderation, but abandoned it halfway through to help rescue a goat that had climbed onto the altar to nibble the leftover garlands. Applause followed the rescue, and someone began a chant demanding the goat's sainthood. The priest declined to comment. As the sun climbed higher, the festival shifted into a slower rhythm. Families shared late breakfasts of cold stew and slightly scorched bread. Musicians played gentle tunes that floated like drowsy bees through the square. Lovers who had disappeared into the fields returned with grass in their hair and carefully neutral expressions. Friends exchanged the quiet smiles of conspirators who knew which secrets to keep and which to transform into legend. By midday, cleanup began. Children chased stray ribbons while elders directed the dismantling of makeshift stalls. Ash from the bonfire was carefully collected and scattered across gardens, a tradition believed to bless the coming harvest. Farmers swore the soil grew sweeter when fed with the remains of celebration. Whether or not the claim held truth, no one wished to risk a barren field by ignoring it. Even the most skeptical joined in, scooping handfuls of grey dust as though sowing fragments of joy directly into the earth. When the last of the ash had settled and the final mug was claimed by its rightful owner, or quietly adopted by someone quicker, the square began to resemble an ordinary marketplace again. Yet an invisible charge lingered, a hum beneath the cobblestones that told every passer-by the festival had not truly ended. It lived on in aching muscles, in the faint scorch marks on the church wall where a torch had leaned too close, in the subtle way neighbours looked at one another with new familiarity. That night, as families returned to their hearths, the village seemed both quieter and more alive. The stars burned clear above the dark roofs, and from somewhere in the distance came the soft, stubborn beat of a lone drum. Perhaps a child testing a rhythm, perhaps an echo carried on the wind. Whatever its source, the sound threaded through the sleeping houses like a promise. The fire would rise again, the games would return, and the cycle of foolishness, fortune and fire would continue as long as there were hands to build a pyre and voices to laugh around it. And that brings us to the end of tonight's journey through festivals of fire, fortune, and a little glorious foolishness. If you're still awake, thank you for wandering these crooked medieval streets with me. If you somehow drifted off along the way, well, that's exactly what this channel is for. Before you head to dreams of bonfires and dancing goats, tap like if you enjoyed the trip, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the Drowsy Historian so you never miss another night of strange, cozy history. Your next adventure is already waiting. Another forgotten corner of the past, another story to carry you gently towards sleep. Until then, rest well, dream curiously, and I'll see you in the next chapter.